Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Trevor Scheck, and I am chair of ASME's Oregon Professional Section. I want to thank all of our volunteers, past and present, and especially those who helped organize tonight's event, especially Pasquale de Wakala for his continued role as our tech and AV guru. When I took fluid mechanics in college for the first time, I recall it was pretty boring, mainly because the instructor thought teaching fluids meant an endless parade of equations without any anecdotes. Later, after deciding I was going to take school seriously, I took fluids again, and this time the instructor was a little bit more animated about the subject, and I discovered a whole new appreciation for fluids. I finally was able to see how it applied to the world around me, and it wasn't just random equations on a page. In fact, I became fascinated by it. So when one of our members, Pete White, first offered to present a lighthearted look at the world of cavitation with some real world examples, I was very excited. And I hope you are as well. I think we're in for a pretty good evening. During tonight's presentation, Pete will be explaining the physics of cavitation, some history, and some fun examples, including one with beer. Not all of our viewers drink beer, but some of us can appreciate opportunities to make drinking beer work related. So thank you, Pete. However, before I introduce our speaker, I want to hand over the virtual microphone to Colleen Kennedy, one of our section leadership team members and our treasurer, to make a few announcements about some upcoming events.
Well, thank you, Trevor. I want to give some information. We are soon scheduling our next technical presentation. It'll be on Tuesday, February 23rd at 6:30, and our subject will be failure analysis methods by Mark Lisson, the owner of Lisson Metallurgical Services in Milwaukee. So you'll be receiving the invitation on that soon. We're also working on researching to still be able to provide some technical tours that we can watch online. We're going to be experimenting with a 360 camera and then try to post-produce or have a video that we can watch together on an online event. And I know we have ASME members joining us from outside the Oregon section. So thank you for attending tonight. We'll be having as one of our members that registered the new Dean of Engineering of the University of Portland, Dr. Brian Fabian. I don't see his name yet. Maybe we'll by the question and answers. So I wanted to welcome to our event. Okay, I'm all done. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you, Colleen. And it is now my privilege to introduce you to our speaker, Pete White. Pete's fascination of fluid dynamics started at an early age, or so he tells me, I don't know, and it has developed into his career. He holds a BS and MS in mechanical engineering from Clarkson University. He has held engineering positions at DNV GL, Graco Inc, Parker Hannifin, and now at the Hyster-Yale Group. Some of his major projects have included developing a pumping system for a 55-gallon drum hot melt system. So that's like a giant glue gun, which I think is pretty cool. Multiple spray paint guns, gasoline dispensing valves, diesel emission systems, and now hydrogen fuel cells. Pete has been an ASME member since his college days and has been active on and off in local sections in Minnesota, Connecticut, and Oregon. He holds 2 patents, a heated follower plates for hot melt adhesives and hydrocarbon dosing systems for diesel emission systems. Pete has published several articles for technical journals and trade magazines and has presented at multiple expos. So it is my honor and privilege to thank Pete for volunteering to present. And at this time, I'd like to say, take it away, Pete.
Trevor, Colleen, thank you very much. Thanks for allowing me to present this tonight. Like Trevor said, I'm a senior engineer at Hyster-Yale. We make a lot of forklifts and other really cool material handling equipment. I'm part of a team that is working on developing hydrogen fuel cells. It's a really cool team, amazing group of people, and we're going to use those fuel cells to help power some of our forklifts. This talk tonight has nothing to do with forklifts or fuel cells. It's just something I really enjoy. We're talking about cavitation tonight. And this title that is up here, I have to thank my mom for that. So she clearly thinks I'm a geek. Thanks a lot, Mom. But, you know, I love you too. So, and she's really correct. So let's go ahead and start with a definition. This definition is right out of Encyclopedia Britannica. for cavitation. So cavitation is the formation of vapor bubbles and within a liquid typically at low pressures. And they occur in places where typically you have accelerated to high velocities. And they give a couple of examples here. Centrifugal pumps, water turbines, marine propellers, and equipment like that. So my first time when I observed cavitation was when I was probably in my early teens. So at dinner every night after dinner, it was the job of my brothers and I to wash and dry the dishes. And I do know that both my brothers actually really hated it when I was in charge of washing, because I had a sink full of water. And what could be more fun for somebody who's going to turn into a fluid dynamics person? You can do lift and drag experiments with spatulas. You could take funnels and repeatedly drain the water out and take a really long time to wash the dishes. So when we were about, I don't know, maybe I was about 13 years old, my parents remodeled their kitchen. And we got a garbage disposal. And boy, you can have a lot of fun with a garbage disposal, sticking all kinds of stuff down it. But when I noticed cavitation for the first time, I wanted to see what was happening inside the disposal. I knew something was spinning in there because you could see all the food disappear. So I did this little experiment. And you take that little safety shield off, that little rubber splash guard or safety shield. You take that off. I put a drain in. I filled the sink with water. I pulled the drain and I let it run in so it would push all the air out of the disposal. And then I put the plug back in, refilled the sink. Now I've got a sink full of water and a garbage disposal full of water. And I pulled the lid off the drain, or pulled the drain out. And you take a glass and you put a glass down inside the disposal, and with a little flashlight shining by it, I have my little sight glass so I can really see pretty well what's going on inside without having to look through waves. And then you reach over and you flick the garbage disposal on. And a funny thing happened on the back side of these blades. I saw these little bubbles. I mean, they're hard to see because it's spinning really quickly, but clearly there was something there. There was a bubble of some sort there. And I knew I had drained all the air out. And so I was really kind of curious about that. You turn the disposal off and those bubbles just disappeared. They didn't float away. They didn't get sucked away. They were just gone. And you could do that a couple of times. So my early research took a very abrupt end when I accidentally dropped the glass and it got sucked inside the disposal. It made a horrible noise, a 3/4 horsepower disposal versus a little thin-walled glass. The disposal survived, the glass didn't. But I was really embarrassed by it, so I kind of stopped doing that. I put the little rubber stopper back in. I don't recommend doing that as an experiment at your house, but it was, I don't know, however many years later, 7, 10 years later, I'm in my first fluid dynamics class and I had a really good instructor. And right there in chapter 1, Frank White wrote the fluid book, no relation to me. He wrote the book. Right there in chapter 1, they start talking about cavitation and this light bulb went off in my head. And I was like, oh, what I saw in the disposal there, those were cavitation bubbles. So I've just been really fascinated really ever since then. So cavitation frequently gets a bad rap. And sometimes that's deserved, but a lot of times it's not. In fact, if we look at the complete definition from Encyclopedia Britannica, this is what they have to say. They come out directly and say it is undesirable because it produces excess erosion on the rotating blades. It creates noise, vibration, reduction in performance, and it can do that. But to just say it's undesirable in general seems a little harsh to me. So in this presentation, I hope to show you some of those undesirable things, but also some of where it can be really fascinating. And sometimes even life depends on it. This is an important sentence here. Cavitation forms when the pressure of the liquid has been reduced to its vapor pressure, typically isothermally. So I'm not going to go into the whole definition. You can look it up. It is Encyclopedia Britannica, and I really don't like that they state that, but they do. So vapor pressure, I'm going to use water frequently in this presentation because, well, we all know what water is and we deal with it every day. So to create a vapor bubble, there are a couple different ways of doing it. And basically what you have to do is you have to cross this line here. And you can see it's dependent on temperature. So if you're above this line in this white area, you have a liquid. And as soon as you cross over into this gray area, you turn into a gas. So, and then as soon as you travel back across that line, increase the pressure, it turns back into a liquid. So there are a couple ways of doing that. And as a reference point, Just a couple background things here. As a reference point, this is all, in fact, all of my pressures here tonight are probably going to be in absolute pressure. And the pressure that's surrounding us in PSI, that would be 14.7 PSI, but we're at 101 kilopascals, which is located here. That's all that air that's pushing down on us at sea level. And as another reference point, if we were to travel up to like 6,000 feet, drive up to Timberline Lodge and Mount Hood, we have a lot less air. We have 6,000 feet less air, and the atmospheric pressure drops to about 8,000 kilopascals. Just kind of as a reference point, and some of that will come up a little bit later as well. So a vapor bubble is when you turn from a liquid to a gas, and there are two ways of doing that, one with cavitation, the other with boiling. And either way, you end up with a vapor bubble. So the most common way, and I think everybody knows how to do this, if we want to boil water and get a vapor bubble, we take our pot of water here and we start elevating the temperature, and we just keep adding more and more energy to it. The heat rises until you get to this 212 Fahrenheit or 100 degrees C. As soon as you cross over that line, you get a bubble, and that's that steam bubble that rises up through the liquid. It reaches the top, it pops, it then cools off in the air, it turns into a vapor in a large area, and you have all these little particles. That's the stuff you can see. You can't actually see the vapor bubble itself. You can't see steam. Steam is invisible. But what you see rising up is the condensed version of that, and it's condensed in the air, kind of like a cloud. So again, if you were up at Timberline Lodge, you would boil your water at, what would that work out to be, about 93, 94 degrees Celsius. So that's how you can create a vapor bubble with boiling water. But what we're going to do in cavitation is we're not going to add heat. We're going to decrease the pressure. And we have to, from wherever we're starting, decrease it all the way down to that line, cross over that line. And what happens when you cross back is that vapor bubble collapses. Unlike the boiling water, where it travels up through really hot water, that vapor bubble can stay and then be exposed to the air. This, we're in a cool liquid, so as soon as we come across, that vapor bubble will collapse. What happens if, let's say we're out here at a 60 kilopascals and 60 degrees C? If we raise the temperature, I'd call it boiling. If you'd lower the pressure, I'd call it cavitating. If you were doing both, I'd say you're trying to split hairs. It really doesn't matter. You're creating a vapor bubble. It doesn't matter which way you get to it. But typically with boiling, you're adding heat, and with cavitating, you're decreasing the pressure. This is just a funny little thing. This is a Mr. Bean cartoon. So he's making a pasta dinner. These are not his words. These are my words. And I found back in my single days when I was dating, I found people who said things like this really didn't get very many second dates. And I happened to have a young woman over one night who was a food scientist. And I made this comment because we were having pasta for dinner. And I made this comment, and she rolled her eyes up into the back of her head. And I kind of thought, well, there goes that up. You know, that date's not going to last very long. But she stayed. We finished our dinner. We went and we had dessert. I'm a big ice cream fan. I think anybody in my family will agree with that. And so we get the ice cream out. And as we start the ice cream, this young food scientist came back with, don't eat that too fast or you might get sphenopalatine ganglio something or other. This is the technical term for a brain freeze or an ice cream headache. So I kind of knew I met my match. And it wasn't very long after that we got married. So a little bit of history, some great names in cavitation, and I'm really just going to focus on some of the early ones and some of the big predominant people. Mr. Torricelli, he was working for Galileo, and they were working on suction pumps. And this is the same Galileo that was looking up at the stars. Quite the Renaissance person back then. So they were trying to develop these suction pumps and trying to figure out the suction head. So if you have your pump at one location, how much suction head, how far can you lift that water? And they were trying to find out what the limit was on that. So Torricelli came up with an experiment where he took a glass tube, he filled it with water, he capped it at one end, and he started raising it up on the outside of his house. And he noticed the funny thing, at about 10.5 meters high, something happened and a bubble appeared. And he didn't really know where that bubble came from. He kept raising the tube up higher and the bubble stayed at 10.5 meters high. And then he lowered it down. When he got below 10.5 meters, that bubble just disappeared. So he was really curious about what this bubble was. Where did it come from? Where did it go? That sort of thing. And he was doing some research on that. And basically what he found, he didn't have terms for it back then, he found a non-inertial cavitation. So this is where you can cavitate things without using that high velocity. He didn't have any velocity at all, but he did have cavitation. So as he's doing his research on this glass tube on the outside of his house, he also realized that he noticed that that 10.5 meters wasn't always consistent. He noticed that it started to fluctuate. And then as he's writing all his data down, he's noticing that it's starting to fluctuate based on the weather. And he could start to sort of predict what the weather was going to be for the day. And being the 1640s, if you're predicting the weather, it can really only mean one thing, and you must be a witch. So he started hearing rumors. He really didn't like the idea of what happened to witches in the 1640s. So smart guy, he quickly dismantled this thing and packed it all up and took it inside. But not to be dismayed, he continued on with his research, looked at mercury, and found that in less than a meter high, he could do the same thing with mercury because it's so dense. He could also do it in his house with his curtains closed so his nosy neighbors couldn't look in. And he essentially invented the first barometer. So this is a mercury barometer, which for measuring the atmospheric pressure, and that's really what he was reading here and noticing in the changes in the weather. And that has become the standard of reading atmospheric pressure for centuries, basically from the 1650s, really up until about 50 years ago. And it's still really kind of used today. This barometer that's shown here in the lower right is just the top portion of it. The rest is down below. But this is one that my grandmother gave to me. She had it, and when I was young and visiting her, I was fascinated by all these, little gradations on here. What does this mean? And, how does this thing work? And what's it doing? And how do you measure things? And I was adjusting it every day to see how much of a change there was. And as she got older, she gifted it to me. So it was really nice to be able to get that from her. It's a nice fond memory. She was a very technical person, should have been an engineer, just had really bad timing. So for Torricelli's work, he did get a unit of measure named after him called the torr. It's a measure of typically of vacuums. And 1 torr equals 1 millimeter of mercury. And just as a reference point, if we looked back at our curve, 1 torr is the vapor pressure of water at 20 degrees C, which is about 2.3 kilopascals. So the kilopascals, the Pascal in here, Pascal was a friend of Torricelli. And they took this mercury barometer and started hiking around. I imagine they're hiking in the Alps because they're Italian and French, if I remember correctly. So I'm assuming they're hiking around the Alps, and they started measuring the atmospheric pressure based on elevation. So, similar to what I showed before with Timberline Lodge. And because of the research they were doing with this, the two of them figured out and had the first and accurate scientific means of describing what wind was. And all of that because of a vapor bubble, a cavitation bubble. Okay, so some other great names. Now, Bernoulli here is grayed out because I couldn't find anything that Bernoulli did that really directly related to cavitation, but this is a talk on fluid dynamics, and as a mechanical engineer, you can't help but talk about Bernoulli. I mean, it's just things that mechanical engineers like to throw out. The Bernoulli equation, it just makes you sound impressive. But he was a very impressive, very influential person in the world of fluid dynamics. And here is a shortened version of his simplified version of the Bernoulli equation. He also had a friend, or at least an associate, Euler, who speculated about flow-induced cavitation. Now, he didn't actually achieve it, but he speculated. And my guess is that he was looking at Bernoulli's equation. He knows there's a constant on this side. We're dealing with water. The density doesn't change. This is a height and a gravitational constant. Those are both constants, so those don't change. So I have two variables. And based off of Torricelli, if I get down to the point where I can cavitate, I get the pressure low enough. To get that to drop, I need to increase my velocity. So he did a lot of speculating. I never get credit for the speculating I do. I do a lot of speculation myself, but he gets credit for at least thinking about flow-induced cavitation. And we'll throw a little nod to Bernoulli. The other thing I'll mention here is I really want to highlight that this is Daniel Bernoulli. The Bernoulli family was a very mathematical family. Both of his brothers, he had two brothers who were both in calculus, and I think one of them was in economics, but very tied to math. His father as well is somewhat famous, and I think he had a couple of uncles who also did things in other areas. So the Bernoullis were very influential. The other thing, Daniel and his father entered a scientific contest in Paris, and they both entered it. They entered it separately, and they tied for first place. They were entered it in two different categories or something, but they tied for first place. Now, if I entered any kind of contest with my daughter, I'd be really ecstatic if we tied for first place. That'd be quite exciting for me. Daniel's father didn't really see it that way. He was actually quite ashamed that anybody would even compare his son to him, to the point where he never let Daniel into his house for the rest of his life. So a little bit of weird family dynamics there. Daniel's father is also known to have taken Daniel's great work of fluid dynamics and plagiarized a big portion of that, and then wrote a book himself. So again, if we're going to highlight the Bernoullis, let's make sure, as mechanical engineers, let's get the right Bernoulli, the guy who was really influential in our field. So moving on a little while in time, we come up with John Thornycroft and Sidney Barnaby. Now, John Thornycroft owned a boat building and torpedo building company in England, and there's still some version of the company around today. His right-hand guy was Sidney Barnaby. Barnaby was his researcher, his designer, his engineer, and he was also a great writer. And in fact, you can still find his books on Amazon or at Powell's. So you can still find his writings today. That's from Sidney Barnaby. But what they were doing is they were trying to get their torpedoes and their ships to run faster. So they were looking at the propeller design. And they noticed on the back side of the propellers, these little bubbles that were forming and collapsing. And they were kind of curious, as I was, what those were. And because of, probably because of Barnaby's work, because he was the main, research person behind it, he started looking into it more and more. And he's the one who created the term cavitation. And cavitation just meaning cavity and at intervals, because he saw these bubbles forming and then collapsing right away. So there have been a lot of other people who have been influential in cavitation. These are just some of the early ones. A lot of it now is done in academia, not to discredit that. But again, just some of the early people that were involved in this. So how do we create a vapor bubble, a cavitation bubble? Again, we need to drop the pressure to go below this line and turn into a gas. So what are some of the ways of doing that? We talked about Bernoulli before, and Euler was right. You increase the velocity to a point where your pressure just keeps going down farther and farther and farther, and you cross over that line and you create a vapor bubble. Another way to do it is with a vortex. Now this is a bit of a combination of, it is flow, and you can use some of Bernoulli's equation there. It is flow based, but also as you have a vortex, things are spinning and they want to accelerate outward. And it creates a very low pressure in the center. That's even true in tornadoes. The center of tornadoes are incredibly low pressures. So here's a picture. This is a very common picture that you'll find in fluid dynamics books. It's a very beautiful picture, at least to me, but it's also a very hard picture to create. This picture is created in a flow tunnel. So they actually have a very controlled flow rate of liquid coming at a really laminar flow across this area. The propeller is actually, it's rotating, but it's stationary. And that allows them to really make sure they control the flow rate to just the right precise amount. It's also a specially designed propeller so that it kicks off a very large vortex. What happens here is the vortex is created and it doesn't dissipate. Again, you see that in tornadoes. They take a long time to dissipate, and that's true with vortexes. So it takes a long time for that to dissipate, and they have set this up so that it starts to break up and the cavitation collapses somewhere after this film. But it is a very beautiful picture, but it's also not very real world example. Typically, like what Barnaby would find is the bubbles would form and collapse right in the area of the tip of the propeller. So a Venturi. A Venturi is when you take a flow area, and I apologize, this is the best picture I could find, but when you take the flow from an area like this, about this size, and you neck it down smaller and smaller. What happens here, again, Bernoulli's equation, we keep increasing the velocity because we have an incompressible flow. We can't squish it down at all. And the velocity keeps increasing to the point where the vapor pressure is reached, and that water then turns into a gas. It's a vapor bubble of water in here. And then as it starts to expand out, you can see it expanding here, those bubbles start to collapse, and you turn just back into liquid water here. Now you'll see it's a very small diameter here, and the bubbles are created, but you can see out here the diameter is actually still pretty large. And the reason it's still pretty large is these bubbles are really taking up a lot of space. So even though it is increased to a large diameter, I've got all these little gas bubbles in here, which are just kind of clogging things up. That's some of that efficiency problems that you have that we talked about earlier. But at a certain point, it does get to the point where the pressures increase and you go back above the vapor pressure line, and then all the bubbles decrease or collapse, and then you're back into the full liquid state. So you can pull a vacuum, as in the barometer. You don't need flow, you just pull a vacuum, you keep lowering the pressure farther and farther as you go up. So a barometer is a good example there. Or you could combine a vacuum with flow. Again, if we were starting at atmospheric conditions, you see this is a very long way to go. It's a large delta. So if we put a flow restriction in, let's say we're sucking something into a pump and we're starting at atmospheric conditions and we're sucking into a pump. Let's say we start throwing a whole bunch of things in the way. We throw in an orifice or a filter or sharp bends, things like that. It'll decrease the pressure coming into the pump. And now if I'm down in this area, the delta is much smaller, so that you'd need a much smaller change in your velocity till the point where you can cavitate. So kind of a combination here of things. The other one, heat. You can see by the curve, the higher the temperature, the easier it is to cavitate, the smaller that delta will be. If you had enough heat, we're just boiling the water. But yeah, if you go out to 80 degrees, and then your delta is probably half of what that is at atmospheric conditions. Okay, momentum. Momentum's really vacuum, but it's really just a segue to an experiment that I've got. And what we have here is a cavitation tube. This is just a clear plastic tube. There's a plug at the bottom. It's filled with water. It's 4 feet high, and I'll cap the top eventually just so it doesn't spill out. What I'm going to do with this tube, and I'll show you the experiment, and I've got a little video afterwards because it's actually kind of hard to see in the video or live. It's much better if you're in person because it happens so quickly. You may not see it because of web speeds and all things like that, but it's still pretty tricky to do. So what are some things that I can do to make it easier? Again, we're going to start at this location because we're pretty close to sea level, and I'm at room temperature. So we got to drop down all the way down to this roughly 2.6 kilopascal. So that's a long ways to go. So some things I can do, I can add heat to it. I could use hot water and I could have a much smaller delta. That would work, but I'm not going to use that. I could get somebody with faster twitch muscles than me to really, shake this thing up and pull it down quickly. But we're in COVID. I can't have anybody else come in to the office tonight. So it's just me. Used to work in the paint industry. I happen to know methyl ethyl ketone, MEK, is at about 10 kilopascals, acetone's at about 25. So those would, definitely benefit me. It would give me a smaller delta. Those are both really nasty chemicals, and I don't want to mess around with them, so I'm going to stick with water. The other thing I can do is add a vacuum, and that's what actually I'm going to do. So I'm going to take my little VinVac here. This is just from, one of those wine saver kits, and put it in the top. And what I found is experimentally, I can drop the pressure to about 60 kPa. Okay, so I'm going to switch over here. Now you should just be able to see me. And I have my cavitation tube here and my little VinVac. So I'll just go ahead and pull the air out of that. You can see there's water to the top, and this is a fairly long stick. It's 4 feet long. There's a little plug at the bottom there. Now, again, you may not be able to see what truly happens in this. I hope you can, but probably not. But I do have a video on it. You will hear a cracking sound, and I'll describe what's happening there. So here we go. So I understand that that is really fast. That's kind of the world of cavitation. But I do have a slow motion video. Okay, here we go. And if you listen carefully, you can hear that cracking sound. So that's what's happening every time I crack that. And I'll go through it real quickly here. So what I do is I raise the tube up. At a certain point, I start to lower the tube. And you can see these bubbles starting to form right in this area, because the momentum of the water keeps wanting to have the water go up, but it has no choice to be pulled down. So the water in here, the pressure drops to the point where it goes below the vapor pressure. Keep pulling it down, and you can see that that vapor pocket, the vapor bubble, is actually quite large. And then as I slow down, you can see that it starts to get smaller and smaller. And then I wish I had a faster high-speed camera. I don't. But what happens next is that bubble collapses. And what you see here, there are a whole bunch of tiny little bubbles in here. When that bubble collapses and it smacks the bottom of that, it sends a shock wave up through the rest of the tube, and it goes very, very quickly. On the back side of that shock wave, the pressure drops to the point where it drops below the vapor pressure, and it creates all these little bubbles up in here. And then that shock wave dissipates, and then there's a secondary shock wave that comes in, and you can see all the bubbles in there. And then that dissipates, and then it just sort of balances out. So again, here, we'll just watch it real quickly. So that's my cavitation tube. So that's just a fun little experiment that I set up. I had seen that somewhere. I can't remember exactly where I saw it, but I thought that was cool, so I made my own. Okay, so we know how to create bubbles. Now, what happens when they collapse? Now, typically the bubbles won't be as big as in the cavitation tube, but when that bubble collapses, it collapses with such force and so quickly that it creates very, very localized pressures in the order of 100,000 psi, or almost 7,000 kilopascals. Incredibly high pressures. So those also tend to form, like at cracks or things like that on surfaces. And it can do damage. I mean, if you repeatedly had that bubble collapsing at 100,000 psi at the same location, it's definitely going to cause problems. And to give you some examples, here's some parts. This is a lobe pump. So there are two lobes that rotate within each other. They don't make contact. There is a thin layer of liquid between them. And you can see for some reason this wasn't designed well, and they have cavitation, and that cavitation is just eating away at the lobes. This is out of a solenoid valve. This is a 316, nice hard metal, before and after picture. Here are a couple impellers. You can see how it's just eating away at the blades of the impeller at different locations. Here on this little surface right here, and on that trailing edge. And then from the Barnaby on the back side of the propeller blade, when he saw those bubbles collapsing, that's what it's going to cause, and it starts to mess with things. There's definitely a noise that happens. I mean, you could hear that cracking sound. That was a very big vapor bubble collapsing. But if you're in a pump or a valve, typically it'll sound like you've got a bunch of rocks or little marbles flying through your pump. A friend of mine used to work at a pump company, and he said the way they described it is that's the sound of your pump dying. And looking at these parts, you see why they refer to it that way. Don't assume if you can't hear the noise that you don't have cavitation, because you still can. It's not super subtle. You can hear it, but if you had a lot of background noise, that background noise might cover it up. It can also throw things off balance. You have a gas as opposed to a liquid then that you're trying to pump. So it can throw things off balance, causing premature bearing failure and greatly decrease your efficiencies. You could see that in the how you didn't get the cavitation to collapse right away because the bubbles were in the way in the Venturi. So it can greatly decrease efficiencies as well. So those are definitely some of the bad things. And in those cases, I agree with Encyclopedia Britannica. So how do you avoid damage? Honestly, the easiest way don't go anywhere near that line. Make sure in your equipment that you don't even come close to this. So stay away from that line. That's the easiest way to say it. It's also sometimes very hard to be able to do that. You definitely want to properly size your equipment, especially when you're talking about pumps and filters and things like that, solenoid valves or regulating valves of any kind. Definitely properly size it. You kind of want to find that sweet spot. And the example I'll use here is, let's say you have 100 psi of water coming in and you have a pressure regulator and you want to regulate your pressure down to 40 psi. Don't buy a 0 to 40 psi regulator. Buy a 20 to 60 psi range, and you cut, because that way you're running in the middle. You're not running on that hairy edge. When you're on that hairy edge, bad things can happen. So you want to be able to, find the sweet spot of whatever that pump or the filter or valve or whatever that is. Run some hand calculations. I do have an example of this coming up. We've got Bernoulli's equation or other things that you can use to run some hand calculations to see what your pressures are, see if you come anywhere close to that. Another great way, and my personal favorite, I love doing computational fluid dynamics, CFD. This is analytical modeling of fluid flow. You can really get pretty advanced here. You can even model the phase change. So you have a liquid phase and you change into a gaseous phase, and then it changes back. You can model all of that. But I say the easy stuff, and I don't mean CFD is easy. I mean, just model a single phase. Model it as an incompressible fluid. Model it as just water. Don't change into a gas. Go ahead and run your analysis. See what your lowest pressure is. And if you're anywhere near this line or below it, redesign your thing to make sure you're farther away from that. Somebody one time asked me, well, how far away from it should you be? It's kind of hard to say, but one thing that you definitely want to do is, let's say you decided, okay, I can handle 5 kilopascals because I'm away from that line. I'm not going to create a cavity, a vapor bubble there. So I'll be okay. But if you find out that that's fine at room temperature, but on a really hot day in Arizona, you're going to get up to 40 degrees C. Now all of a sudden you've got problems. So make sure you're designing for the complete temperature range and for also the fluid. You can lower the temperature. If you've got a really warm liquid like water and it's really warm here, lower the temperature if it's possible, because you can see then that delta goes from being fairly small to fairly large. That's one way to do it. I will say frequently here. That's most of the time what's true. But sometimes you actually want to raise the temperature. In this case, you want to think of like a really thick, gooey liquid, like an oil or a grease or something, or molasses in January type of thing. It doesn't flow real well. And if you warm it up, if you're trying to pump it and the pump's having to work really hard, you can get incredibly low pressures from that. But if you were to warm it up and decrease the viscosity, it's going to pump a lot easier. So it's going to be a balance, and it's going to depend on your liquid. But for raising the temperature, think of those really thick, gooey liquids. Increasing the localized pressure. Again, if you're running down, and you've got an inlet area, what can you do to increase the localized pressure, especially like at the inlet of pumps? You want to remove restrictions in your flows. Get rid of any sharp bends. If you have a sharp 90-degree bend, make it a nice big radius in there so the flow is just gentle going over that. Filtration, that's why they have filters downstream of the pumps, not upstream, especially if your filters start to clog, it can cause a bigger restriction. Orifices and a vena contracta, these are funny. A vena contracta is if you have a large reservoir and you drill a hole and you've got even a decent sized hole and you've got a nice square edge on it and you think, oh great, I got a big hole, I'll get a lot of flow through here. What a vena contracta is that as the flow is coming into that, it has the ability to recirculate in there, and that recirculation zone is essentially a dead area. It causes a restriction. It can take your flow area and cut it in half without you even knowing it. So definitely take a look at that. I hate putting this on here, but material selection. Material selection is kind of a cop-out. Sometimes you need to do it. And that's basically saying, I've tried to do all these other things, and I do know, maybe I'm at a vapor pressure of 10, and I do know that I'm going to get up to maybe 40, 42, maybe a little bit higher. Occasionally I might sneak over that line. And then material selection will become important because you don't want a brittle material where those cavity bubbles will collapse and really do damage quickly. You want something that can kind of take the pounding. I'm not a material scientist, so I can't really give you a lot of examples on that, but it does make a big difference. So let's say we want to find the vapor pressure. How do you go about that? Google it. You know, you Google everything today. Take a look at an MSDS, a material safety data sheet, or the newer safety data sheets, the SDSs. And in an MSDS, it's going to be in section 2. This example is of a paint thinner. Again, I used to work in the painting business. Graco made painting equipment. And you find in section 2 the vapor pressure. They're going to give it to you at one point. And it's important here because they're looking at the hazards. And for a lot of these, the hazard is it can spark off. And if you have a vapor, it's easier for that to spark. So in the SDS sheets, it's now in section 9. And I like these a lot better because not only do you have the vapor pressure, I've got the density, I've got the viscosity, all the stuff these fluids people love. I've got the boiling point. Now this is a very specific, this is a paint, and it's a Sherwin-Williams paint. And not only is that, it's a very specific paint, it is their duration paint, which is a water-based paint. And that'll be important. And look at the boiling point. I'll mention this again in a second. Look at the boiling point and look at the vapor pressure and know that this is a water-based paint. The other way, and if you're going to be doing this a lot, ask the supplier. Suppliers love to provide this information, and they will give you more than just a single data point. They'll give you a whole curve. That's definitely true with Sherwin-Williams. When we used to request the data for them, they love to give that to you. They gave you, based on temperature, and really gave you all the information. They like to share it because you're using the liquid that they're selling. They're using the paint that they're selling, and they want it to really work well in your system, so they'll give you that information. This is a coolant that we use in our hydrogen fuel cells. Again, this is public information here. This is a very, very low conductivity coolant. And when we requested it, they gave it up to you over a very wide range, and they also gave it to you based on the concentration of the coolant mixed with DI water. And just as an example, coming out of our engine, typically out of the fuel cell, it's going to be 60 degrees C, and we've got a 50% concentration. So we've got a vapor pressure of approximately 0.15 bar. In bar, you can convert over to kilopascals. So that's the vapor pressure. So when we design our systems, we make sure that nowhere in our system do we drop anywhere below that 0.15 bar. So if you can't find it, review the makeup of it. What's this made up? What's the medium made up of? As the example again is, you look at that Sherwin-Williams paint. It's a water-based paint. So the liquid in there is water. So if you really need to and you can't find any other information, give it your best guess. Call it water. If there are two different liquids in there, at about the same ratio, use the one that has the higher vapor pressure, because that's the one that's going to cavitate first. Don't use the lower one. Okay, here's an example. At what speed do you start to see cavitation on a torpedo? Now, I will say, if there are any torpedo experts out there, this is a really simple example, so cut me some slack there. This is a very common problem that you'll find in fluid dynamics books, and this is one version of that. So I'm an engineer. I love making assumptions. Let's assume we're going to shoot this torpedo off in salt water. Seems to make sense. It's going to be about 10 degrees C, and we're going to shoot it, and it's going to stay about 1 meter below the surface of the water. And I'm not going to worry about the propeller. I'm really just looking at that casing. So we're going to ignore the propeller. There's also a really big assumption here. We're going to use Bernoulli's equation because that's a great equation to use. Bernoulli's equation is based off of an ideal fluid. And an ideal fluid is incompressible, which water is. It's laminar, which at these speeds, it's really not. And it's also non-viscous, meaning there's no resistance to it, which doesn't exist. So there really is no such thing as an ideal fluid, and that's what this equation is based off of. So again, that's another assumption that we just have to sort of chalk up. So, okay, this is Bernoulli's equation kind of written out, and this is the stagnation side, and this is the side at velocity. Some things we can do immediately is our height is not changing. So we're always going to be 1 meter. So we can just cross that out of the equation. We don't have to worry about that. And a stagnation velocity is 0. You square 0 and you get 0. You multiply it by anything and you get 0. So we just knock that out of the equation. And we're left with the stagnation pressure, the vapor pressure, density, and a velocity. So we go and we look up our knowns. We know what the density of water is. I just Googled these. We know what the density of salt water is. 1 meter deep of salt water, the pressure is about 110,000 kilopascals, and the vapor pressure is 2,290 pascals. Now you'll see something here. These are in pascals. Everything else I've been doing is in kilopascals. This is important because if you were to use kilopascals, you're going to get the wrong answer. You need to make sure that when you look at these equations that you balance the units to make sure that the units are going to come out correctly. Some people hate this. Some people love it. I was talking to somebody else and he said he actually loved this when he was in college. Personally, I can't stand it, but you have to do it. There's no way around it, because if you were to use kilopascals, which is mostly how we write these when we're talking in engineering speak, and when you look the values up, it'll probably say kilopascals. You put kilopascals in here, and again, it's wrong. So, okay, we have our knowns, we have our equation. We rewrite Bernoulli's equation and solve for velocity. Convert that over, and you're at about 34 miles per hour. There is a value that you'll see in a lot of fluids books. It's called the cavitation number. I was fascinated by this and also confused by it for a long time. But what that is it's a scaling value. I always wanted to solve for it and have it tell me something wonderful, but it's real. That's not what it's set up for. It's a scaling value. And what it does is based on experimental data, whether you're going to run like real torpedoes or whether you're going to run computational models, it's going to adjust for things. It's going to adjust for a number of these assumptions that we've made, especially dealing with Bernoulli and the fact that there is no such thing as an ideal fluid. It's going to adjust it. It will give us a conservative value. I've seen other examples where they do apply a correction factor, and this goes from about 34 to about 38 miles an hour. So again, we're doing a hand calculation. It takes into account a lot of assumptions, and it is a simplified answer. So the fact that this is a little conservative, that's okay. We can deal with that. You know, it's a quick hand calculation. You want better results, run a computational fluid dynamics analysis on it, because you'll get really accurate results from that. Okay, this is a little bit of an aside. This is not cavitation, but I feel it's important. As you decrease the pressure of a liquid, entrained gases want to come out. And as you approach, you know, the vapor pressure, the entrained gases just keep coming out more and more. Water, you know, has air in it. It's what the fish breathe. It's what they rely on. But you boil that water and then cool it down, and there's no air in it, and you drop fish in it, and it's going to die. This isn't by no means exact. It was just a nice cloud that I could put in there from PowerPoint. So here's an example you can do at home when you're making pasta the next time. As you're waiting for your water to reach the vapor pressure, you'll notice on the bottom, this is tap water that I've poured in here, and you start heating it up. As it warms up, and we're only at 68 degrees or roughly 155 degrees Fahrenheit, really far away from boiling, you'll see all these little bubbles in the bottom. That's not boiling yet. We're not at that temperature. These are air bubbles that are coming out of solution, and they'll form along the bottom, along, you know, some of the little scrapes that are on here, and they'll even but they'll detach from the bottom, and they'll rise up. They'll sit on the top surface. You can see a couple of them here, and then they'll just sort of pop. Take your spatula and run it across the bottom, and you'll see all these bubbles floating up. Those aren't steam bubbles. It's not cavitation. That's just the entrained gases that are coming out. So there are people, and then, you know, once you're boiling, that's when you get the vapor coming out. So there are people who can benefit from that. One of them are ice carvers. If you want to get, you know, that real glass, like that crystal clear ice, they will boil their water. They'll boil it a couple of times, in fact. And I have as an example here, hopefully I don't drip on my computer. There's a piece of ice that is where the water has been boiled. And there's one where it hasn't. So you can see if you want that crystal clear ice, that's one of the things that they do to get that nice clear ice for the ice carving. Another area that they'll benefit from that are ink companies. So ink, when they're printing the ink, they don't want bubbles to come out. They don't want these air bubbles to come out. They can't boil it. You know, water can take a good hearty boiling, and then you cool it back down and you still have water. But if you did that to ink, you'd destroy it. So what they do is they drop the pressure really low. They don't actually cavitate, but they drop it really low to allow all those gases to come out. They agitate it a little bit. And then once the gases are out, then they increase the pressure again and seal it up so the gases can't come back in. Opening a bottle of seltzer. Okay, we won't even go down to that real low part, but if you just take a bottle of seltzer, you're at about 300 kPa, and when you open that, all those entrained gases come out, and I just got my computer really wet, sorry about that. So opening a bottle of seltzer, we come down, they've injected all that carbon dioxide into the bottle, and it starts to come out. So big difference here. These are not vapor bubbles. They're not steam bubbles. They are air bubbles or some sort of gas, but mostly air. A big difference here, they don't pop, or excuse me, they don't collapse, they pop. So they rise to the top of the surface, they sit there, and then they pop. A cavitation bubble is going to collapse in on itself, and that doesn't happen with the air bubbles. Okay, so some cool stuff, and this is where Encyclopedia gets it wrong. This is neat stuff, at least I think so. So where can we benefit from cavitation? The cleaning industry, semiconductors, jewelers use it, and medical companies. They can dip things, and here's an example. This is a jewelry cleaner. They can dip things into a liquid, they blast it with ultrasound, and when that ultrasonic waves hit the part, they actually are able to create little tiny cavitation bubbles on the surfaces. And as those bubbles form and collapse, they send out shock waves, and you've got a piece of debris. It has the ability to blow it off. I was at my mother-in-law's. She had one of these, and we all threw our jewelry in, and she was all excited about it because, you know, you pull out your rings and everything, and they're nice and pretty and clean. So I described what was happening, and they just sort of rolled their eyes at me, but it was fun. I think they actually enjoyed it too. But this is used a lot in the semiconductor processing. It's used a lot in jewelers, sanitation, you know, sterilization for medical, things like that. Another area, also medical, kidney stones, when they're inside your body. This is a before and after picture. And they will, again, they'll blast it with ultrasonic waves, and the cavitation around the kidney stone will help break this thing up into a bunch of little pieces. Now, I'm not a chemist, but apparently you can somehow benefit from advancing the oxidation process. You saw that on some of the cast impellers where you saw rust forming, so it does advance the cavitation. All right, pistol shrimp. These guys are really cool. There are a mess of these off the coast of Oregon. So what a pistol shrimp does, look at that claw in that. Isn't that huge? I mean, he's clearly right-handed or right-clawed. But what he does is he cocks this little claw back. And when he cocks it back inside the main part of the shell, there's a cavity in here. That cavity fills with liquid. And then there's a plunger. And when he slams this thing down, let's say he waits for a little fish or crab or something else to swim by. And he slams this thing down, and he slams it so hard that the water shoots out. And the water going that fast, the pressure drops to the point where it drops below the vapor pressure, and he gets a cavitation bubble. So this is the best I could do on the images. It happens very quickly, and somebody with a very high-speed camera took these. So the cavitation bubble forms as he's slamming it shut. And as that bubble collapses, it sends out that shock wave that we saw in the cavitation tube, and that shock wave can actually kill and stun small fish or other crabs, at which point this little pistol shrimp grabs them and eats them up. If you have the chance, if you can find it, NPR had a really good article on pistol shrimp, and they talked about specifically off the coast of Oregon, and it was really fascinating to hear. It was, I don't know, it was like a 15-minute description of these guys. There's also a shark called a thresher shark, whose tail is about the same size as of his body, or maybe even longer. And he uses that. He swims up to a school of fish and he actually snaps his tail. And again, he creates that vapor bubble. And when it collapses, it kills a bunch of the fish in the area, and then he can eat those. So, you know, from the shark and the shrimp point of view, cavitation is really important. Another interesting area, this is Niagara Falls. And as the water's flowing over, and this is true with, you know, a lot of waterfalls, we've got a lot of them around here. But as the water is flowing over, the velocities increase right at the edge to the point where it cavitates, and it can really help with the erosion, just eating away at the rock. Niagara Falls is an example. I looked this one up, can erode at about 1 meter a year, which just is incredible to me. If you've never been there, this is standing on the Canadian side, looking around at the Horseshoe Falls. The United States is over here. When I've stood here and you look over, you're right at the edge. And I always want to take a ruler and somehow and stick it down, because the depth of the water here has got to be 8 to 12 feet deep. It's just a vast amount of water going over here. So another place that, you know, is kind of cool is you get some erosion due to waterfalls. All right, so some super cool stuff in cavitation. Now, supercavitation is when the vapor bubble totally encompasses the object. And what that does is it just really reduces the skin friction. Stick your hand out the window, you know, driving at 60 miles an hour, and you can feel your hand kind of cuts through pretty nicely. If you do that through water, you can really see the difference, you know, a gas versus a liquid. So some examples of that, the Soviets in the 1970s decided they'd try to make a torpedo that would supercavitate. And they did succeed, and they called it the VA-111. They did succeed, but they had some problems with the steering. They couldn't get this thing to go very straight, so they didn't really, you know, accomplish much, but they did get it to supercavitate. Well, not to be outdone, and with 35 years of more technology, the Germans took on that challenge, and they called theirs, and look at this, 2 words, 39 letters, but it's supercavitating underwater running body is what that really means. So they were able to get theirs to work, and they actually got it to be able to steer. Their torpedo is 8 meters long, 0.5 meter in diameter, and it's rocket propelled, and it goes 250 miles an hour underwater. I would not want to be an aircraft carrier with something like that coming at me. So that's some pretty neat stuff. So putting a few things together, and really this is just for fun. This is when the beer comes in. So my experiment with beer, and I'll show you. If you have seen this, this is not an uncommon barroom trick. If you haven't seen it, it really just means that you have nice friends. But we're going to use beer. I chose Corona in part because, well, it sort of fits the time, you know, with the virus that's going on, but also because it's a clear bottle and we can see what's going on inside. Let's say you go out with your friends to the bar and you're hanging out with your buddies, and you go up to the bar and you get your beer. And so I got my Corona here, and the bartender gives you your beer, you open it, and you walk back and you're hanging out with your friends. And one of your friends decides it would be really fun to take their bottle and crack the top of yours. And so they have their bottle, and I should hold that up a little bit higher. Apologize for that. If I need to, I can do it again. Let me do one more, make sure I'm holding it up high enough. That's why you have extra beer, right? Okay, so here we go again. I'm holding it at the right spot. So I got my beer, your friend comes along and makes a mess. Okay, so here we go. And then we'll go through what happens. So there your friendly friend comes along and makes a mess. And what really happens at the end is you end up with about 1/3 of the beer that you started with that one crack, and it's very flat beer. It's really not very good to drink at all. So here we go. We'll do it slowly. We crack the bottle. All right, now what's happening here? We hit the bottle really hard. Okay, yes, I'm using a rubber mallet. Occasionally, the top of the glass will break if you don't do it, you know, or if you do it too hard or don't do it just right. So just for safety's sake, I used a rubber mallet. So you crack the top of the bottle. We take the glass bottle and we accelerate it downward very quickly, kind of like my cavitation tube, where I raised it up and accelerated it down. But by cracking it, I'm just sending it down very fast. And then in the bottom of the bottle, the beer doesn't want to move. So the pressure inside the bottle drops really, really low in here and cavitates. You can hear the cracking sound of it cavitating after, you know, right after you strike it. And remember all those entrained gases, all that carbon dioxide in the beer, that wants to come out of suspension and does, because we've really lowered the pressure and also agitated it immensely. And you see that all those gases almost come out all at the same time, overflow, and really just make a total mess. So now, if you see this at a bar, you can tell all your friends how this really works, and you can really show them how much of a geek you really are. But honestly, they probably know that already. Okay, so that's my little beer experiment and how that ties into everything. And okay, so wrapping things up here. So cavitation can be very costly. It can really wreck your performance on your system, but it can also be avoided. And I even say easily avoided. You got to do your homework. You got to do your planning and your design work. Do this up front. Don't wait till the end, because when you wait to the end, that's when you have problems, and that's when you can't do anything about it, and that's when you're stuck. Cavitation can be very beneficial, life sustaining if you're a pistol shrimp. But it can also really just be a lot of fun. So that's my talk on cavitation. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you, Pete, for that wonderful talk. I learned quite a number of different things. And, you know, I was really struck by one thing that I learned, which was that ice carvers boil their water before they freeze it so that they can make it very super crystal clear. I guess, you know, I had always just assumed that some of that, you know, foggy glass was entrapped air from, you know, homogeneous freezing, or, you know, not, you know, uniform freezing temperatures, et cetera. So that was like a revelation. It's a small thing. It's not technically cavitation, but it was very interesting to me. I'd like to say, you know, thank you, Pete, so much for this presentation. And as part of that thank you, I am going to share my screen and show everyone that we are awarding you a certificate of appreciation to you, Pete. It is of course, in the time of Corona, this is not an actual framed certificate. It is a PDF. I will be emailing this to you after the presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you very much.